Something I've been thinking about a lot is the impact of streaming and the various streaming services. Um, and I mean, the reason why is because I moved recently. Historically, the way that I would watch movies, if you didn't know, I'm obviously a pretty big horror and exploitation, I guess if you want to throw it in there, cult film fan. Historically, the way that I watch these is I'd buy DVDs, throw away the cases, and then have these large binders full of movies. I have like two horror binders, a binder of anime seasons, and so on. And that's how I'd watch movies. But recently, I've had to switch to streaming, or more or less to streaming. And I don't pay any subscriptions to any of the streaming services, but I have family members that do. So I've used Netflix, I've used HBO Max, I've used Disney Plus, I've used Netflix, Tubi, what have you. And what, when you use these, what comes across is that you have these very limited libraries, and that you need to have multiple ones if you want to pick through movies that you'd want to see. And what you do if you only have one or two libraries is you just click through them for a very long time, because it's different than like when you go to a video store in the 90s and the 2000s. I'm born in the 90s, so I never experienced it in the 80s, but when you go to a video store and you'd go to your genre and you could look, and there'd be all the classics, and there'd be obscure stuff, and then there'd be these new boards, and it was a lot easier for me to pick stuff there. Now it's not like there is any classics or new stuff. It's all just jumbled together, and oftentimes there's no real way to tell the quality of these. You don't know what's a classic or at all or anything like that, and you just kind of have to pick from a thumbnail, and that's all you can really know. I mean, you can juggle back and forth and watch trailers, but if you're really going to use that as your primary means instead of using like IMDb or some YouTube channel that gives you suggestions, or Letterboxd or something, it's just not very good. And getting back onto the limitations of this, what you really notice is that there is maybe like something like Netflix, for example. There's some stuff, maybe there's like one or two movies from the 70s, a handful of movies from the 80s, more movies in the 90s, and then, the Family Guy joke. My friend told me once, Netflix is the greatest website in the world if you think the peak year of film was 2003. And that's what you really get from using a lot of these. The only stuff that's there is the 2000s, the 2010s. And when I was a kid and when I was growing up, being exposed to a lot of stuff really young, my parents were pretty indifferent towards if I'd watch an R movie. My younger siblings were more of a handful than me, and I was pretty self-entertaining, and I guess I was above average. I have no idea why they'd let me see something like The Thing in third grade, John Carpenter's The Thing. But I would go through as I was a little kid, and I would, fumble around in a VHS section with the classics, or tune into like AMC's, Fright Night Halloween special, or Turner Classic Movies Halloween specials, and like that's how I would be introduced to horror movies. And I wouldn't just watch, Alien Resurrection when I was like younger. There's like a new horror movie or something. Like I would go back, and a lot of times I'd be interested in stuff that would be much older, right? I'd be interested in Universal horror movies, like the 1931 Todd Browning Dracula, or Universal's Creature from the Black Lagoon, or like I watched Brides of Dracula, the Hammer movie on Turner Classic Movies. I watched Army of Darkness and Fright Night, Below the Age of 10 on AMC, and that's generally better to watch AMC and Turner Classic Movies and Sci-Fi Channel movies, I guess, if I was a parent, because those were edited out. But a lot of these things, that's how I'd have exposure to, through cable and through video stores, and I was able to go through and watch stuff and have like the sense of the history, like the history of movies, without ever reading or anything. And then when I got the internet, and you could go to Wikipedia and you could go on YouTube, and this is before I knew how to get stuff through questionable means. Something that I would do is I would watch Cinemassacre's Monster Madness reviews and Brad Jones, the Cinema Snob, and all his reviews. And I was able to learn a great deal about the history of horror and, by extension, the exploitation genres through them. And that in these three kind of like stages, being younger, stumbling into stuff when I was older and my parents would let me, stumbling stuff on cable. And when I got older and I could renting stuff, first VHS, then DVDs, and then finally getting the internet and then being exposed to Brad Jones and the Cinemassacre. That's what really laid the foundation for me to be a horror fan. And, I'll watch something from the 2000s, and I'll watch something from the 80s, and I'll watch something from the 70s, watch something from the 60s, the 50s. I like all of it. I generally like all horror content, more or less. There's more genres that I like, subgenres or whatever, I like more or less than others. But generally speaking, I could go, I had the ability to watch, the oldest public domain stuff at the click of my finger. Go to the video store, because where I live, and still in Montana, there are a handful of video stores left. But, rent movies, get those, and just fill in the blanks over time. Eventually, when I was a teenager and I was, interested in Cinemassacre, and I was interested in Brad Jones, we got the extended cable past the 60 channels or whatever, where you get the movie channels, and then I was able to watch them. And, Netflix kind of came out when I was in college, and by the time that happened, I had a part-time job, and I would just buy DVDs at pawn shops, and get like this huge collection. I'd be very, very knowledgeable in horror and exploitation. There's this point in high school where I was like, kidding, I was like, I'm gonna be a director, I'm gonna be a screenwriter, and I started making YouTube videos and all that, and it was like, I'm gonna watch these classic movies, and I'd watch, like, The Seventh Seal, which is a good movie, and I would watch, like, newer movies that are supposed to be these great art house films, and I just remember just, like, trying to like them, trying to force myself to be a cinemaphile, and it's like, no, I want to watch Ed Wood. I don't give two fucks about Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu, and or whatever the hell filmmaker was big at that time that was making movies. And with the Great Awakening, it went down this hole of like, I think one of the newer Academy Award winners was like, was like a gay black kid, like his life story of being a gay black kid, and it's like, holy shit. This is some shit, because it's not about, what the new Candyman came out, and Argent was like, I'm gonna go see this, you really like Candyman, do you want to see it? We don't live in the same place, obviously, but would you see that, Serp? And I'm like, no, it's just gonna tell me to hate my people, and regardless, it's gonna be horrible. Like, in college it was very intensive, and I had a really hard time keeping up on a lot of horror movies and that was the beginning of the Great Awakening too. So I went back after I was able to have a lot more free time, and I started watching a lot of these movies from the 2010s. Stuff like Heredity is like outstanding, but I went through and I saw all these Rotten Tomatoes and all that shit, and I'm like, I'm gonna watch Get Out. And so I set up this streaming party with Trillian and with Argent and all these other people. There's like a dozen people. And they're all talking, and they're having the time of their lives laughing. And I'm like, I'm going to be a serious cinemaphile. And and I turned off their volume on the, the watch thing, and I just watched it. And I was like, even with all the anti-white stuff in this and all of it, this is just one mediocre movie. This is really underwhelming. Like, it's there's nothing to this. The only reason why it's being applauded is because the filmmaker is black and it's anti-white, and it was like a lot of these movies are like that. So I'm not gonna be some fucking cinephile. That's stupid. That's gay. I'm gonna watch fucking Troll 2. That's 1,000 times more entertaining than any movie that's ever gonna win an Academy Award. But going back into, if I was 12 today and the only thing that was around was streaming, how on earth would I be able to, develop what I was interested in when I was how would I be exposed and develop the taste that I have? Because outside of some random movies on Tubi, which, by the way, I do think is the best streaming service, there are no movies from the 70s or before generally on any of these streaming services. Any of them, period. So you are not going to be exposed to very good stuff. It'll have like Ghostbusters 1. That will be your sole movie from the 80s, like Ghostbusters and, Back to the Future or something, or the original Star Wars movies. There's nothing from the 70s or before to be exposed to. And of the 80s and 90s to be exposed to, it is fucking almost nothing. So there's entire segments of movies that you just have no idea that would exist. That when I was 13 or whatever, I could turn on TV, what is Hammer, what is Friday the 13th, and if you had cable, and maybe if you still have cable today, you can be exposed to that, and I could go to a video store, rent them, be exposed to it, and watch them, and because it's the Halloween season right now, you're going to go to the grocery store, and right at the front of the store is going to be Count Chocula, Boo Berry, and Frankenberry, right? And these are these things that existed from the 70s, which are a parody of the Universal monster makeup of Dracula and the Universal Frankenstein. These are pretty big things, even into the 90s and 2000s when I was a kid, that it was still this huge cultural thing that was imposing, that those 30s and 40s Universal horror movies, and it's those are completely, not only do kids not know, but it's completely devoid of our culture. All these classic films, if you're going on a streaming basis, you can't watch them. You're completely unaware they exist, and it's there was decades after decades after decades where people were rewatching these and they're being shown on TV, and now they're just gone. And that's unfortunate, but it really goes back. If being into film today, like I said before, with the Great Wokening and going back and looking through all these new movies that are coming out, maybe there's a reason that you can't go on the million billion streaming services and you can't pick out any older movies, and that's because that's part of the Great Wokening. They don't want you to go back and watch something from the 70s, go back and watch some Vincent Price thing and then see everybody's white, see that Christian morality is just explicit in every one of these movies. In a way, going back and watching these classic movies is pretty threatening. So it's no surprise they're essentially being memory holed when we get into this age of streaming. Now, going more into the streaming, there's a dozen services, and they cost anywhere from $5 to $10 to $15 a month. Nobody's going to be able to afford this, and it's just going to be cut down, and somebody's going to have a monopoly, or there's going to be two of them or something, right? Like that, right? Netflix was the one that broke through. I'm pretty sure there was ones before Netflix. Netflix broke through, but then when Netflix broke through at the beginning, and they had a pretty big catalog, and it was for a long period of time, there's the term Netflix and chill. People would just get Netflix because it was the sole one that broke through. There wasn't really that much competition. But then, Amazon and HBO Warner, right, now they've joined in, and now there's Disney Plus and, HBO Max and Hulu and all these things, and some of them are owned by the same company, and you got to pay more to have multiple subscriptions, and it's a deal because it's Disney Plus and Hulu are the same thing and so on. But You know, who the fuck is going to get Paramount? You know, there's good Paramount movies, but like, is it just Paramount? Like, you know, I love Full Moon, but I'm sorry, Charles Band. If I'm going to get one streaming service, I don't think I'm going to pay for Hulu or Shudder or whatever. Like, I'm not going to pay $60 a month to get 5 different types of cable, because it's turning into cable again, but even more expensive. So what's going to happen with this? You can't watch the older stuff. It's basically outlawed, whether because the people behind it don't think that it's going to make any money, it's not worth the money to license it, or for more nefarious, like Great Reset, Great Wokening reasons, it's gone. You know, you're getting to this point where cinema is being hidden from the people, and then it's this art form that's going to be hidden, and you know, you're going to have to pay all this money to try and see this stuff. And in the 80s, right, it was very hard before the age of VHS and the age of DVD and you know, Blu-ray came out. Before home media, you really had this power with the beginning of home media, with VHS and DVD and all that. You had this power, and I definitely have taken advantage of it. You just pick it up. If you get it used, $2, you get a movie for the rest of your life. Download it, watch it with your friends, have parties with your friends. You know, there's nothing more I love than watching some fucking horrible, shitty movie with a bunch of beer with my friends. That's my favorite thing in the world. But now it's just being pushed back, and you have even less control. It's going backwards without home media. And these people, these corporations, they have monopoly over these movies. And you know what the problem with this is, other than having to buy 10 different services, is that if there's only one hard copy of this that's connected to the server for streaming, that is going to create an atmosphere where you're going to lose films again. Because with the history of film, if you're really knowledgeable with film, in the silent age, I think the majority of films have been lost, because film originally, analog film, is very flammable, and you wouldn't rewatch these things, so they would be streamed once, and maybe a few years later they go through theaters again, and that'd be it. And they go into these big warehouses at the production companies, and there'd be fires, and they explode, and all the films would be lost. So there's a great majority of films from this. I think that the majority of silent era films are lost, but there's like a large minority of films from, you know, before TV came out that have been lost. Doctor Who episodes that are lost. The sound era, after the sound era until TV, before they started streaming stuff and people were able to pick up on it, a lot of those are lost. And if we're going back towards this model where they're not being widely distributed, you're going to lose films again. And it's going to be a disaster with everything being digitized. So there are all these new movies that are going to come out, and if they're going to eventually stop DVD or stop Blu-ray, you're going to get to a point where you're going to lose movies, because the only place these movies will exist is this downloadable, not downloadable, streamable way to watch them, and you can't download them because the companies are preventing you, and it's going to be lost. Their servers are going to go down, and you're going to lose those movies forever, or their backups will be lost. Companies are retarded, and you know, you can't watch anything from the 70s or even the 80s and before, so they don't even give a fuck. So they'll be lost anyway, simply because they don't give a fuck. So that definitely is a disaster. And then going back with this multiplicity of streaming, you know, there's a half dozen things, and it's more expensive to have every single one than to have cable, and so on and so forth. You start running into this problem that eventually other ones are going to be pushed out. Maybe MGM got bought out by Prime. So I'm thinking what's going to happen is, even though Netflix was the founder, it was like the Atari. It's going to get fucking killed by the biggest corporation in the world, Amazon. because Amazon owns MGM now, so now they have all those movies plus whatever native Amazon movies. So Amazon or maybe Disney is going to get a monopoly, and maybe it'll be the two of them. But there's going to be a monopoly, and then when you get to a monopoly, this loss will be even worse. Because if you have a single streaming service that's going to distribute all of your films, then they're going to care even less about the preservation. Because monopolies don't care about quality. And that's just a very sad thing. You're not going to be exposed to these classic movies. You're not going to be able to even see them. They're going to be locked either for political reasons or simply the corporations believe that no youth wants to watch them and no old people want to watch them anymore, and they'll be lost forever. And, I was just thinking the other day of how hard it is to get you walk into Target and there's no PS5s. You walk into GameStop, there's no PS5s. You walk into Walmart, there's no PS5s. And it got me thinking, is this peak rare metals? Are we actually going to see, it's going to be harder and harder to get computers. So, and as a person that believes in the Club of Rome thing and that you're going to have peak oil, peak coal, peak rare minerals, and so on, eventually you're not going to be able to have computers, and we're going to run out of these films someday. And, it's very sad, but that's just the way it is. So, it's kind of a dark future if you're a movie fan. I think I would like my kids to see, Todd Browning Dracula. Like my grandkids to see it, but my great grandkids probably aren't going to see it when they're living in their in their hovel sheds and riding on horses. But anyway, I just thought I would share my scatterbrained views on this whole streaming and the future of film, and in particular, genre films and cult movies and obscure movies for weirdos like me. That's what we like to watch.